Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, both to the people here in the room and to the people watching online. Welcome to this event where we'll present some of the key findings and also hopefully have a lively discussion of the Emissions Gap Report 2022. This will be an old school event, but before I get into that, maybe just say that please, this is supposed to be a silent event, so there are headsets and you are encouraged to use them. This will also make it easier for you to hear presentations that are provided online. So, as I said, this will be an old school event in the sense that we will have quite a lot of presentation and then quite a lot of time for questions and answers. So no fancy gimmicks or anything like that. We've chosen to do that because we have a really nice lineup of speakers today. We have lead authors from all but one of the chapters of the Emissions Gap Report, and we really wanted to give them an opportunity to present the findings of their respective chapters. So with me here, we have Giacomo Grassi from the Joint Research Centre, one of the lead authors of Chapter 2. Then joining us in spirit and online, we have Takeshi Kuramochi from New Climate Institute, and we have Michelle Den Elsen from PBL, Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. Then to my far left, we have Nicholas Hoerner presenting Chapter 5 on transformations in different sectors, also from New Climate Institute. And then we have Aline Monnier from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, presenting findings on food systems transformations. Unfortunately, Mr. Deepak Dasgupta, who would be presenting the finance chapter findings, had to cancel his participation today. So I'll try and just make a very brief summary of the findings of that chapter. I'm probably forgetting something, but let's get started. So on behalf of UNEP, it's a very great pleasure to invite you to hear some of the key findings of this 13th Emissions Gap Report, produced to inform discussions here at the COPs and internationally on climate change. The Emissions Gap Reports focus on the difference between where we're headed in terms of global emissions if countries fully implement their pledges for emission reductions by 2030, and where science tells us we need to be to get on track to achieving the temperature goal of the Paris Agreement of keeping global warming well below 2 degrees, preferably 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So this year we convened 77 authors from 41 institutions across 23 countries to help produce the Emissions Gap Report. We always have a steering committee that oversees and guides the process. We send out chapters for external review. This year we had almost 100 external reviewers, and we also give the governments of the countries specifically mentioned in the report an opportunity to comment on the preliminary findings. So this year, and now I'm going to see if, yep, here we go. Two questions stand out in the Emissions Gap Report. First of all, what progress has been made since COP26 in Glasgow? And that question, of course, arises because last year we saw it was the first time since the adoption of the Paris Agreement that countries were asked to come back with new and updated NDCs and mitigation pledges for 2030. What we saw was that these pledges were far from sufficient to bridge the emissions gap in 2030, and that more was needed. And as a consequence, countries were requested to come back already this year, revisiting and strengthening their targets for 2030. Secondly, it's by now evident that incremental change will no longer be sufficient to get us on track to the Paris Agreement temperature goal. We need economy-wide transformations. So this year we look into a few sectors and a few systems changes that are needed. And more specifically, we cover electricity supply, industry, buildings, and transportation. And then we look into systemic cross-cutting changes for food systems and also for the financial system. So without further ado, we'll move to the chapters, and I'll pass on this clicker to Giacomo. Please, Giacomo.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Anne, and good morning to everybody. Globally, the rate of growth of greenhouse gas emissions, upper panel, has slowed in the last decade compared to the previous decade. This is due to a number of factors, including the global reduction in new coal capacity, the substitution of coal by gas in developed countries, and the increasing pace of renewable energy worldwide. Due to the COVID-19 pandemic, global emission dropped by about 5% between 19 and 2020. However, this rebounded in 2021, as we will see later. The emissions from removals from LULUCF remain substantial, as you can see in the lower panel, but are deeply uncertain. And in particular, the lower panel show a large discrepancy between what the global models, as also included in the PC6 assessment report, shows that indicate a large source from the land use change and forestry sector, and national inventory, which indicate a sink. Therefore, a negative number is the green bar in the bottom panel. The difference between these two estimates is explained in the following slide. Essentially, global models and national inventory apply different approaches to estimate carbon fluxes from LULUCF. The main difference is that they use different system boundary to define what is managed land and to estimate the anthropogenic CO2 sink, especially in forestry. Both approaches are applicable in their own specific context, but they are not directly comparable. The approach taken in this UNEP emission gap report is that when we show the country trend, we use national inventory data, so we are consistent with the data the country themselves submit to UNFCCC. When we show global emissions, we use global models to ensure consistency with the carbon cycle literature, which is assessed, and scenarios, which is assessed in the APC AR6. 8 major emitters, including 7 countries and international transport, represented 55% of global emissions. In these countries, LULUCF, according to national inventory, was a sink in China, US, India, Europe, and Russian Federation, whilst it was a source in Indonesia and Brazil. The emissions before and after COVID show that emissions rebounded, and in 2021 were higher compared to 2019 in a number of countries, including China, India, Russia, and Brazil, while it remained lower in US, Europe, and also for international transport. So far, we have shown emissions based on national territories. When we express the national emission based on a consumption base, the picture changes. Of course, emissions increase in high-income countries and decrease in those countries which are net exporter of goods. When these consumption-based emissions are expressed on a household levels, like in this figure, we show it emerged large discrepancies, both within countries and between countries. At global level, so the world level column, we show that the bottom 50% have an average per capita emissions of less than 2 tons per capita per year. And collectively, these represent 12% of global emissions, while the top 1% have a per capita emissions of more than 100 tons of CO2 per year, and collectively represent about 70% of global emissions. With that, I pass the microphone back to Anne. Thank you.
Thank you, Giacomo. And I will pass on the torch to Takeshi.
Do I see the slides? If not, yes, thank you. So now we move on to chapter 3, which covers the national level climate actions for both 2030 and beyond. And for the long-term emission reduction strategies, my co-lead author, Michel Denelze, will be presenting. So I will focus on the 2030 climate action and ambition. So here's the snapshot of the new and updated NDCs as of late September. You can see that in total, 166 parties representing more than 90% of global greenhouse gas emissions have submitted new and updated NDCs. The number is large, but compared to the last COP26, we only found 14 parties submitting new and updated NDCs. And according to the latest climate action tracker analysis, that covers all the submissions up to a few days ago, the number increases up to 28, but still it's not a lot. Looking on the positive side of things, about half of these new NDCs have lower 2030 emissions, and that those countries represent more than 3/4 of the global total emissions. So in that sense, it's a incremental but still a good news. And also most of these new and updated NDCs have either better greenhouse gas coverage or more unconditional components of their NDCs, which means that these targets will be implemented within their capacity on their own, which is another positive news. Next slide, please. So compared to the number of countries that committed to the more ambitious NDCs, when you actually look at how much increasing of emissions there is, it's not that encouraging. So when you add up all the numbers of the new and updated NDCs compared to the previous ones, it amounts up to an additional reduction of about 4.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalents by 2030 compared to the initial NDCs. And you can see on the waterfall charts, that's a lot of additional reductions attributable to China, EU, the US, and a few other countries. And when you just zoom in on the new NDCs that are submitted since COP26, it's only about half a gigaton. And these results are consistent with the UNFCCC synthesis report on NDCs that was published a few weeks ago. Perhaps the main difference comes from the fact that the UNFCCC report only looks at the NDCs before and after on the paper, whereas we also look at what the emission levels are under existing policies that are implemented. So even if the NDCs have been made more ambitious on the paper, still, if that new and more ambitious NDC is not ambitious compared to their baseline or the emission projections under current policies, then we don't consider that to be delivering anything additional. So that makes a bit of a difference compared to the UNFCCC studies. Next slide, please. So as I explained, so in this report, we also look at the emission projections under existing policies and measures. And for G20 members, we show that the implementation gap, which is defined as the difference between the projected emissions under current policies and emissions under full implementation of the NDCs, is roughly between 1.8 and 2.6 gigatons in 2030. So G20 members in particular, but also all countries around the world have to strengthen their policy implementation to at least achieve their NDC targets, which are collectively far from 1.5 or emission consistent trajectory. Yes, then I hand over the slide to Michel. Thank you.
Thank you, Takeshi. Over to you, Michel.
Yes, good morning. Can I see the slides? So, good morning. My name is Michel Nelson. I'm from the PBL Netherlands Environmental Assessment Agency. I'm going to present chapter 4, the emission gap. So the main message is that, as already indicated by Anne, that the emission gap in 2030 remains high. This figure shows basically the projections under the 2010 policy scenarios, so no policies until 2010. Then there are the emission pathways for 2 degree and 1.5 degree. Next slide, please. Then there's the projections for the current policy scenarios, so taking into account the policies up to November 2021, and also including the Inflation Reduction Act. Next slide. Then the emission projections under the unconditional scenario. Next slide. Then the emission projection under the conditional NDC scenario, so assuming the full implementation of the conditional NDCs. Next slide. Then we move to the emission gap. So there's still a gap between where we're heading for and where we need to be. So there's a gap of around 12 to 50 gigatons with respect to 2 degree pathways, and an emission gap of 20 to 23 gigatons for 1.5 degree pathway. And the figure also shows that there is a gap between the 2010 policy scenarios and the current policies and the NDC scenarios. It clearly shows that these current policies and the NDC scenarios are not enough to bring us back towards the emission levels that are needed for the Paris Agreement goals. All the messages from these figures is that the updated NDCs since COP26 lowered the projections by less than 1% compared to the projections of last year. The unconditional NDCs lowered the projected emissions by 5% compared to the current policy scenarios. And the conditional NDC scenarios projected the emissions by a reduction of around 10%. So, but what we need in order to get to the climate goals of the Paris Agreement is a 30% reduction to get on track to 2 degree and a 45% reduction for 1.5 degree. So it's not enough. So now we move to the global warming implications. Well, this all leads to severe global warming implications, as indicated here. Without further strengthening of the NDCs, the world is on a pathway towards global warming far above the Paris Agreement goals of well below 2 degree, preferable 1.5 degree. The figure also shows that the policy currently in place limits global warming to 2.8 degrees. The unconditional NDCs would lower it to 2.6 degrees. And the projection becomes 2.4 degrees for the implementation of the conditional NDCs. And this is all for a 66% chance, but only for the implementation of all NDCs and the net zero commitments. That would lead to a temperature increase of 1.8 degrees. So summarizing, this temperature projection only gets close to the Paris Agreement goal if a combination of the net zero scenarios and the NDC scenarios are considered. It requires the implementation of all net zero pledges. Well, that's a big question. However, the credibility and the visibility of these net zero pledges remains highly uncertain. This graph shows the emission trajectories implied by the NDCs and the net zero targets of G20 members that have a net zero target. And it basically shows that the emission trajectories implied by the NDCs and the net zero targets of G20 members highlight discrepancies between the short-term policy implications, the NDC targets, and the long-term net zero targets. And what we see is that the members that have already peaked their emissions need to further accelerate their emission reductions to decline to net zero in the net zero target years. And we also see that members whose emissions continue to increase through 2030 under the NDCs will require further policy shifts and strong investments, including adequate support to developing countries where applicable, to achieve the emission reductions implied by the national net zero target. So it's basically not enough, and the main message is that, well, this graph shows that there's low confidence that these national determined net zero targets will be achieved. Now we'll hand it over to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Sakesh and Michel. And I'll hand over to Nicholas. We'll now turn to the transformation part of the report, starting with Nicholas Erner.
Yeah, thank you very much. And well, the UNEP emissions gap report always has been looking at the gap between where emissions are and where they should be. And well, this is really much focused on greenhouse gas emissions. But what we really need to do is initiate a full transformation towards zero greenhouse gas emissions. So thinking about only marginal improvements on the emission level is not sufficient. You have to really think the whole transformation through. And that is what this chapter, this new chapter this year is trying to do, and putting in place a conceptual framework on what kinds of things you have to do to initiate and then to pull the transformation through. And for some of you that may be nothing new, but I think it's important to collect this information from different reports. So that's what we did actually. So we searched the literature and found certain recommendations that are supported by the literature that you have to do to initiate the transition. And basically it's three things that need to be done in each of the sectors. The first one is to avoid lock-in. So we are currently still building a lot of fossil fuel infrastructure, things that will stay for a long period of time and that will be totally in the way of a transition towards zero energy or zero emissions with renewable energy and very high energy efficiency. So avoiding new fossil fuel infrastructure, avoiding new intensive CO2 intensive industrial infrastructure, avoiding inefficient buildings that are built today. So that's something that you definitely need to do, or avoiding new connections to gas for new buildings. We definitely can do something different here right now. So that's the first thing. Second thing is to prepare for zero. So initiate the technology development that enables you to go to zero in the long run. And for the electricity supply, we are there. We have developed renewables, wind and solar, quite well. I think for renewables now, it's more to prepare for a system where there is a high share of renewable energy in the system, intermittent. So what happens if the sun is not shining and the wind is not blowing? For industry, we don't have in all sectors the technology yet that brings us to zero. So we need to initiate and develop, for example, zero-emission steel and zero-emission cement. That's something we need to do today already, even if that doesn't reduce a lot of emissions at a singular plant. You have to develop it so that it can be done in the long run. Same for transport. There we do have the solutions now with electric vehicles and public transport. We need to implement them. And for buildings, we have it as well. And then the third element that you need to do is then, once you have these technologies, you need to implement them at large scale. And for electricity supply, it would be supporting renewables. For industry, one thing you can do already now is electrify industry, so go away from fossil fuel energy sources and basically go to electricity. For transport, you have to rapidly roll out zero-emission transport modes. And for buildings, you basically have to retrofit the buildings so that there are zero energy. So that's the overall framework. And what we've done as well in this chapter is to provide recommendations of what individual actors could do, different actors. On the next slide, we see the recommendations for the national governments. That's actually something that I think is very well known and nothing new to most of you. But I think it's very good to write it down what country governments now need to do. And again, on the top of the list is remove fossil fuel subsidies in a socially acceptable manner and remove barriers to the expansion of renewables, but also stop the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. That's something that the national governments can do, and you can do that in all the different sectors. But the interesting thing that we here have provided as recommendations as well is for other things. So for international cooperation, well, international cooperation, that's the whole theme about this conference. So how can countries help each other, not only countries, but also other actors in this transition? And we provide a few recommendations here, what can be done. For example, cooperate on the just coal phase out, that is already happening. Cooperate on developing new zero-carbon basic materials, so zero-carbon steel or zero-carbon cement, or work on buildings. So, for example, provide access to favorable conditions to finance for zero energy buildings so that you build the right thing at the right point in time, or support each other on skills and knowledge in the building sector. We also have a few recommendations for subnational governments, what they can do, set renewable targets, and I think an important part for subnational governments is the planning process, which is important for transportation and buildings. They're usually responsible for the planning. You can have a planning process that goes for urban sprawl, or you can think of planning that is very dense. That would make a huge difference and has a long-term implication. And then we have a few more recommendations for businesses, investors, and citizens. I think businesses have a very important role here to play. All of them are responsible for greenhouse gas emissions. They have to look at their own emissions, reduce their transport emissions, reduce their emissions in the building stock that they have. And the businesses that have currently a business model that is based on fossil fuels should definitely think about their business model and find a different one that is based on a sustainable future. Investors and private and development banks have similarly an important role. They channel the money and they basically have to think about how to divest from fossil fuels or to engage with the fossil fuel companies to make them do the switch. I think that's the most important part. And then finally, there's citizens, all of us, taking the right choices when you choose your transport modes, help the transition in the building sector and consume sustainably. And with that, I invite you to look at the detailed recommendations. And I hand over to Anne.
To Aline.
Oh no, to Aline directly. Here you go.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to present the chapter 6, which focuses on the transformation of the food systems on behalf of the other authors. First of all, it might require a definition of the food systems and why we took this approach. It was really to make sure that food security remains at the core of any climate change mitigation strategies in this domain. Food security is really key, especially if we try to connect the supply side and the demand side. And this is really how we will ensure that food security is not compromised by climate change strategies, climate change mitigation strategies. We have a lot of trade-offs and synergies in these transformation domains, for example, with land, biodiversity, water, and so on. So also these integrated strategies are really needed on the food system side to avoid these potential trade-offs. When we look at the GHG inventory classes from IPCC, these food systems emissions then would encompass most of the emissions from the agriculture side. But on the land use and land use change side, it would really focus here on the emissions related to the conversion of natural ecosystems to agriculture. And so all the aspects about sequestration and restoration of natural land here are not included in this chapter. But here we also include emissions from energy, industry and waste sectors, which are related really to the transportation, the production of the input for the food systems, and also the storage, for example. Then we looked at the progress that has been made in terms of reducing emissions from food systems, different components over the last 2 decades. And we, on the land use side, so we really focused on the deforestation aspect. And here, the first comment is that there is still a lot of uncertainty, surprisingly, on emissions related to deforestation. So depending on the source that we use, we can come with different conclusions, even though the bottom line is really that we haven't made enough progress, despite all the commitments that has been made and all the pledges regularly at these COPs to halt deforestation. There has been really too slow progress. And also this uncertainty in terms of the emissions from deforestation highlights the fact that there is a lot of progress needed in terms of monitoring of the emissions from deforestation. Second part is the agricultural side, and maybe this is where we have seen most of the successes in reducing emissions. For example, on the nitrogen emissions, globally, emissions still increased, But in some high-income countries, we still had stabilization or reduction of emissions, and often in relation to policies which were not directly targeting climate, but for example also the water quality. Then on the supply chain, this is really where there has been a huge increase of GHG emissions over the last 2 decades. And this is really related to the transportation, the processing, also the retailing and so on. And this is really where now really action is needed to reduce emissions, because this is still expected to increase very fast in the coming years, especially in the global south. The good news is that there is a large potential to reduce emissions from food systems, and also with large co-benefits, as I already mentioned. So here in this figure, we see that, first of all, in a business as usual scenario, we will probably have still large emissions increase from the food systems by 2030 and by 2050. But we identified these 4 main domains for action. So the first one is the demand side changes. So on the consumption, on the food consumption, currently in many countries, the food consumption is too high, leading also to health issues. So this is not only a waste of resources and emissions that can be avoided, but also a loss and also a burden for the social systems. Then we have, of course, like the protection of ecosystems. So also then it's really about translating into actions all the commitments to halt deforestation, with especially laws to avoid the conversion of rich carbon ecosystems and the enforcement of these laws. Then we have farm level improvements. So this is really to reduce the GHG intensity of the farm production. And here also, when we looked at also good examples and case for successes, in many cases we saw that this was possible without reducing the productivity. So this also is quite important. And then the last part, the decarbonization of the supply chain. And also here, it seems that food systems, there would be really a lot of potential, maybe more than in the overall systems for the use of energy, to really substitute that with renewable energy alternatives. And all that could really then lead to a pathway which would be compatible with the 2 degree and with a bit more effort to 1.5. Of course, like this is no single measure, and here it's a bit arbitrary, this distinction of the impacts of each domain, but they will have the combination of all will lead to the greatest benefits, and this is really like a combination of measures that has to be taken by governments. For example, here, since we are in the EU Pavilion, I would like to emphasize the role maybe of the farm to fork strategy for the EU, which is really about that, a food system approach, and then also encourage that this is really then taken as an example, and then with clear measures for actions. In the report, we then highlight what could be the role of different actors also, from the governments, from also cities, which play a big role in this domain, and of course citizens. So I will also invite you to look at the chapter for more details. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you to all of you. The final chapter of the report looks into how the finance system can be transformed and basically be changed from currently being a barrier to transformation to being an enabler of transformation to mitigate climate change. What we see is that more investments are currently going into fossil fuels than to mitigation and adaptation combined. And this, of course, needs to change dramatically if we are to keep 1.5 degrees alive, basically. Based on the latest IPCC report, it finds that investments in mitigation need to be scaled up by a factor of 3 to 7 by 2030, and mostly in developing countries. And this basically requires a huge shift from fossil fuels to sustainable energies. The financial system has its own and quite complicated dynamic, as this figure tries to explain, and I'm not going to even try to go into details with it. I would need some of the lead authors to do so. But that means that one approach is not enough. And in the chapter of the emissions gap report, we focus on 6 actions or 6 approaches to financial system change that will be important to carry out in a coordinated and way and in parallel. And this includes what you can read on the slide. It includes increasing the efficiency of financial markets, introducing carbon pricing to a much larger extent than what we see today, nudging financial behaviors of different actors, creating markets, mobilizing central banks, and also setting up climate clubs and cross-border finance initiatives, where, for instance, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships could be one example of new types of climate clubs, so to speak. So I would encourage you to read, for more information, to turn to the report, which of course is available online. With this, we would like to close the presentation part of this session and open the floor for discussion and questions. But first of all, I would invite you to give the presenters a big hand. Thank you very much. So any questions? Ooh, we have one question already. Great, somebody is willing to kick off the discussion.
Stefano Battiston, University of Zurich, and IPCC author, Chapter 15, Finance. So, of the Working Group 3 mitigation. So, your last slide was about the dynamics of the financial system, and one of the statements was currently the financial system is actually not necessarily enabling the transition, but maybe even hampering it. So my question to you is, in the background of the fact that countries are the vast majority of countries are lagging behind. Signals from the markets are that essentially the risk associated to oil and gas and in general fossil high carbon projects is not perceived as higher risk than the low carbon. So all the signals are basic, and financial system is keeping all those recommendations are essentially not taken on board currently. So then how do we go from the current situation to where we want to go? Do you have a kind of a theory of change of what has to change from, and how would you, in addition to the recommendation, so your recommendations are very welcome and I think very spot on, but how, it's more broadly, there is a kind of a circular problem, chicken and eggs. How do we break that vicious circle? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any other questions we should take at this point? Well, now of course yeah, please.
Hello, I'm Sasan Sachi from NASA JPL, California. My question is about the projections. It seems based on the NDCs and different sectors, we definitely do not meeting the projections for 2030. At least this is what I got from the slides. So is there any assessment that which sector has more chance, either LULUCF or different parts of the industry, can rapidly or get closer to what they're predicting or projecting to get there? Or that assessment is still not there, or that also is a gap?
Thank you. We have one more question over here to the, there first and then.
Hello? Oh, yeah. Hello, Stephanie Moore from Humane Society International. I've got a question for Alina. I just wondered, could you elaborate on the climate change potential of reducing overconsumption of meat, which was mentioned on one of your slides? and also give us your insights on how we can encourage policymakers, governments, to promote demand-side changes to food systems. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Johannes Svensson from IDRI, and I will shoot another question at Aline, so it's good. Basically, I was wondering, among all the measures, all the 4 categories of measures, have you been able to look at the overall impact on land demand? In terms of, farm level measures could have, or could increase land demand or could decrease. Conservation could, all of these would have an impact on land demand. So I was just wondering if that's been part of the reflections around the report. And then I saw that the 4 to 5, I couldn't see exactly, but 4 to 5 gigatons annually of CO2 equivalent emissions was sort of the 2 degree scenario. So I was wondering if you have looked at the potential of food systems to also go to compatibility with the 1.5 scenario. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we'll take a round of answers to these first questions and then take another round of questions. Actually, let me start with Michelle and Takeshi online. If you would like one of you to respond, or both of you to respond to the question regarding the projections and the sectoral potentials, maybe?
Yes, maybe I'll take first stab at it. Thanks for a very spot-on question. In the GAP report this year, in this chapters 3 and 4, we do not look specifically into the sector-level emissions and how the sector-specific ambition or implementation gaps. That said, there are studies available that provide that kind of insights. One example is the State of Climate Action report, which was prepared together by New Climate Institute together with Climate Analytics and WRI. Nicholas, who's sitting there, can elaborate on that. But there are differences in the progress made across different sectors. So, for example, road transport, electric vehicles, they're comparatively more advanced or closer to a 1.5 degree compatible transition, but still the effort is not enough. And if you go down to, there's a whole list of sectors and actions by rating how far they are from 1.5 compatible level in terms of transition. So please take a look at the reports. You will find quite a lot of useful information there. In general, all sectors really have to ramp up ambition, and there are no sector that are really anywhere really close to 1.5 compatibility at this moment.
Thank you, Takeshi. Michelle, do you want to add, or are you fine?
Yeah, thank you. I don't have much to add. I only can refer to some of the literatures from integrated assessment model studies where we also have compared current policy scenarios and 2 degrees and 1.5 degree scenarios at the level of sectors. And there's quite some literature around, but yeah, it would be good to have a look at that literature. But basically, many of the sectors are quite behind what is needed for 1.5 degree.
Thank you very much. Maybe just to add, in some of the previous emissions gap reports, we've actually provided analysis of the sectoral emission reduction potentials by 2030, showcasing that there is sufficient technical and economic mitigation potential by 2030 to bridge the emissions gap. Of course, the longer we wait, the more difficult it will be to actually realize this potential by 2030, and it is becoming increasingly difficult. What is clear is that there is a huge potential to make significant emissions reductions in all sectors, and that what we really need is leadership and government action to bring this about and accelerate it. Unless anybody here in the room would like to add, I think we can take the tricky question. The tricky question here is from you regarding how do we actually move from the current situation with the financial system being a barrier to it being an enabler. And it's the 100 billion question maybe in this context. I don't have a clear answer, and I wish that we had Deepak here who could provide much more clever comments and responses than I can. But I think what we see is that gradually we are seeing some small changes. Changes are happening. There's a growing awareness amongst financiers and investors. We see banks being more aware. We see a growing understanding of the need for de-risking, for instance, investments in renewable energy and so forth. So I think we see a lot of small initiatives, and much like across all the sectors and all the areas that need transformation, it's just that they're happening too slow and at way too small a scale and level for them to really take off. I think, I was wondering that Nicholas might want to add, because in some sectors we do see some shifts.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you. And you were saying that, there's still the financial sector is still investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. And actually right now, because of the energy crisis, we see a huge rush towards new gas infrastructure, LNG pipelines, new oil and gas fields. And if you look at it, it's a total oversupply. Yeah? So the amount of infrastructure that is currently planned for new gas supply is much, much larger than anything if it's supposed to replace the exports from Russia, for example. The infrastructure that's currently planned is capable of exporting gas twice as much as gas Russia ever exported. So there's a total oversupply, and that's I think very astonishing. Why does the financial sector support those kinds of developments? Because it's pretty clear that some of them will be stranded assets in the long run. So that's, I think, a significant problem. I think the financial institutions have a significant role there in doing something. The investors that invest in different projects and in different companies, they, I think, have understood that it is only a sustainable strategy to invest in companies that have a sustainable strategy themselves. And there, the engagement of the investors with the companies that they have shares of, I think, is a very important lever to move the financial system in the right direction. One other thing I wanted to say is about the level of urgency. We do this report now for the 13th time, Anne was saying. And each time we are saying, hey, there's a huge gap, you need to speed up. And it feels a little bit like a broken record. And we cannot solve this by incremental change, doing a little bit here, doing a little bit there. It has to be a fundamental shift in how we do things. We have to move into emergency mode and do things that are a little bit outside of what we imagine right now. And it's in every sector. As the earlier question is, which sector can do it? All sectors have to do more, and all sectors can do more. And you really have to do a step change and not do a little change here and there. That's, I think, the important message from that report.
Thank you, Nicholas. And then, Aline, there were three questions to you. Please.
Yes, thank you very much for the questions. So maybe on the first one, on the clarification on the meat consumption scenarios. So this is mostly the work of another lead author, who is Marco Springman, who worked a lot on that topic. And so what I showed on this figure was the additional benefits of moving from flexitarian to vegetarian to vegan. So we can really see that as a kind of maximum benefit, but it didn't include the land impacts of that. So I think that here it is less that, in fact, the overall potential of these demand side measures. And how to maybe convince more the policymakers to tackle that aspect. I think that there are different things. First of all, I think that there's a lot of noise now. All the reports almost mention the importance of demand-side measures. So I think that at that point, it will materialize in some actions from policymakers. There has been, for example, a whole chapter dedicated to demand-side measures in the IPCC report this year. But indeed, the revision of the dietary guidelines would be a good step. But of course, it has to translate into economic signals at some point. And here I think this is really like the heart and the difficult part of the change. It's because there is a discussion to have with agri-food business and the private sectors, which currently, I think, resists a lot to get any financial or economic signals on some products which are not healthy or not sustainable. And I think that now it needs a bit of courage also of policymakers to really have this discussion, this difficult discussion with the agri-food system, with agri-food private sector. Then maybe on the question of Johannes. So here in this chapter, we didn't do new analysis. So we were really using existing literature review. For this potential, this is based also mostly on the IPCC report that came this year and Marco Springman studies. But we have the potential to do that assessment, right? We have models in many different places with the Fable consortium. Now we really try to have that at this country level, and where it will be indeed very interesting, and this is what we try to do, to isolate the impacts of each single component and see when we combine in isolation what are the specific impacts on land, for example. And maybe about your question on the 2-degree target and why not 1.5 and so on. So this is at least what we saw from the literature, that it could lead to matching the 2-degree, but this is of course not what we want. We would like to be a bit more ambitious, and I think that there is room for that. For example, I think one thing that was not taken into account here is the potential for carbon sequestration on agricultural land which is not used anymore because maybe the demand is reduced or the productivity is increased. And here the restoration of this, I think, agricultural land is something, or agroforestry systems also, which has been only partly taken into account, can really, I think, help us to bridge the gap to the 1.5 and be more ambitious. But this also, I think that there are analyses going on, and I hope next year we'll have better answers.
Thank you, Aline. Thank you all. I think we have time for a few more questions, if there are any in the room. Yes, please.
I'm Qiming from Taiwan. I'm very curious about the food system, especially the meat consumption globally is increasing, especially the developing country. Very close link to the GDP. More rich people, more meat. However, some such kind of the less meat, more vegetarian, just like ethical or norm things. No really information to provide them how can we do that or not. I'm wondering, in the food system change transformation, is any kind of the methodology or education or any kind of system we can do in the future?
Thank you. Any other questions? Yes, over here.
Yeah, thank you. My question is to Nicholas. You were saying that we need to be radical and have solutions that is bold. So you're saying about to be on the emergency aspect, that we need to be radical in tackling the problem. Can you give us an example? What do you mean, and how practically what you're thinking works?
Thanks. I would actually like to add one question. We have one more there. Two more.
I am Marta Juarez, Costa Rica. It's very interesting to see this gap report and the outcomes, but also it's very important to point out that in the report, the majority of the polluters are the more advanced country, which is the developed countries. And then the consequences of this climate change are in the south, in the developing countries. So also, I would like to remark that in the report is saying we need transformation. But also, in my point of view, we need to transform ourselves. We need also to change our mindset for consumption and production. So the transformation cannot come alone. The transformation is by us. So it's for example, the case of Costa Rica, we have been implementing, economy plan of decarbonization of the economy that could be an example for other countries to follow this transformation that we have been putting 30 years of policies regarding the environment. So in that point of view, we also are part of this problem, so we are part also of the solution. And the report makes clearly that this transformation is important and key to reach the targets of the Paris Agreement. We are late, but we need to be positive and to have hope. And this report gives us, the pathway how we can achieve the 2030 agenda. In this regard, I congratulate, the authors of this report. But we need to think how we can also contribute as individuals in this transformation. Thank you.
Thank you. Then there was one more question, and then I think we'll have to have a short round of responses and then close the session, unfortunately.
Thank you very much. My name is Agnes Yopterik from Kenya. Thank you very much for your presentation. But as I listened to this presentation, I'm a little bit depressed in the sense that there is lack of progress, that will leave the world on a path towards global warming for above the Paris Agreement of below 2%. And listening to your presentation on the transformation, we already know what we need to do. Did you, in your report, try to find out why there is no progress? What are those underlying reasons that we are not doing what we are supposed to do? And this concerns me, and I concur with Costa Rica. Kenya is from the global south. We don't contribute much to the emissions, but we suffer the consequences. As I speak here in COP27, we are going through a major drought back at home because of the results of climate change emissions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good. We have a few questions. Let's start with the food systems again.
Yes, thank you very much. So indeed, I fully agree. Education will be a big component of success to achieve this transformation. I think that indeed education at the school level and then for the future generation, as for example we did for recycling waste, and it worked very well. But also education of the decision makers on exactly how much can be achieved through these changes so that they are really convinced that they need to act now.
Thank you. Over to you, Nicholas, maybe on the emergency and what are the radical actions.
Exactly, and I'm equally frustrated as you over here about the lack of progress. And well, as I said, we are saying the same thing all the time, and nothing's happening. That's indeed frustrating. That's why I was saying we should move into emergency mode. And what do I mean by it? I think the world is already now used to go into emergency mode for the COVID pandemic, and now for the energy crisis. Governments have done things in emergency mode. So, for example, for the COVID pandemic. All of a sudden it was possible that we all work from home. And some of that is a radical change that was unthinkable before, and now it simply has been done because we have been threatened. For the energy crisis, it's the same. We are threatened about high energy prices, and governments are ready to spend a lot of money, much more money than ever before, on helping consumers to cope with the high energy prices. That's also something that was unthinkable before. And these are the kinds of actions that you need to do for the climate crisis. The developed countries should mobilize large amounts of money to invest into the right technologies to help developing countries to do the right thing. And that's basically the radical shifts that need to happen. And I'm hopeful that governments can do it because they have done these radical shifts for other crises, not for climate crisis yet, but at least they have done these shifts for other crises.
Thank you. Any of you, especially you, Ellen and Nicholas, who would like to give some examples of what are the barriers? Why is change not happening? Or why are we not making enough progress? Because I know that your chapters also look into the barriers to transformations.
Well, probably because status quo is always more comfortable than change and radical change. So probably that's one reason. But indeed, I think that I like what you just said. When we are threatened, then we react, and we can react very fast. But the problem is indeed that there are also actors who will lose from these transitions, or at least who do not see the benefits yet of those transitions, and of course oppose and fight very much, and sometimes with a lot of financial power, to resist to these changes. So they are really the key actors now to convince, to unlock this potential, and that at least they stop the lobbying which is against these changes.
Thank you. With that, I'd like to close the session thanking all of you in the room, thanking all of you online, thanking all the presenters for a very good and engaging discussion as well. And hopefully we can all contribute to bringing about the change that we desperately need. Thank you very much.